Okay, it is 7 o'clock and I always believe in starting right on time. So thank you everybody for joining the Find Your Fit webinar tonight. We're talking about standardized tests, who needs them and who wants them. I'm Mary Pat O'Neill and I'm an independent college counselor here in the Redmond area. I started volunteering with the Lake Washington Schools Foundation back in 2016 and created the Find Your Fit program, and it's been wonderful to see it grow. I'm joined tonight by my friend and colleague, Matty Steiner from Compass Test Prep. And last year, Matty and I did a webinar together too. Last year, I think it was January that we did it. And we were halfway through the, well, in the college world, what we call the cycle of the first big test optional year. And now we're a year past. So now I think we have more facts and data to talk about. Oops, why isn't this working? Okay, anybody who ever attends my seminars know that I always have trouble here. I don't know why I have trouble.
You're doing great.
Yeah, I know, but my screen doesn't. There we go. Okay.
Aha.
So there we go. I don't know why. It's just technology is not my friend, although it's my friend. Anyway, so tonight the way the format is, so Maddie and I, this is conversational, although it's scripted, because I wanted to make sure that I didn't ask questions that Maddie couldn't answer. So feel free to ask questions. We're going to stay afterwards, but because there's two of us, we're both going to try to read the questions if we can. Tonight is being recorded, and it'll be sent to everybody who attends or who signed up. And then also it will be available on the Lake Washington Schools Foundation website. There's a whole bunch of on-demand webinars, all the different ones that we have done in the past, and they usually end up on YouTube. So we are YouTube stars, just in case you didn't know it. So
finally,
I know
my dreams are coming true.
Mine too. Okay, so we're going to start with the questions. There's a poll in there. I'm kind of curious to know what grade. Actually, it's not a poll; it's a chat. But what grade the students are in. I'm curious about that, to know if your class of 25, which would be a freshman, class of 24 is the sophomore, and then class of 23 is the juniors. And just so everybody knows, I tell this to my students all the time, and Maddie, you can concur with me or disagree with me if you want, but I always want everybody to know there is no crystal ball on this. It so much is going to depend. It's going to depend on the student. It's going to depend on the college. It's going to depend on the major. It's going to depend on perhaps what grade you're in. I don't know, but let's get started with this. So here's the first question. And actually, I said we were going to stop sharing so we can just look at each other now. Okay, there we go. Okay, all right. So Maddie, let's start with the ACT and SAT. Prior to the pandemic, can't believe it's 2 years now, although it looks like we are coming out on the other side, hooray. So what percentage of high school students would submit their test scores with their applications prior to the pandemic? Because, again, 2 years ago, any student I talked to, I would say, I'm really sorry, but you have to have test scores. It wasn't optional, even though there were test optional schools prior to the pandemic, but everybody still sent in their test scores. So talk about what happened in 2021 and what you're seeing for 2022. Any data that you have, we'd love for you to share it with us.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, just so I'm not some weirdo talking head that people can't contextualize, why Mary Pat had asked me to speak is at Compass, although we are a test prep company, and I'll provide a little elevator pitch for what we do professionally at the end of tonight. But I think what we're equally well known for, which Mary Pat is alluding to, is the data, the free resources and information that we provide regarding college admission testing. And it's usually my distinct pleasure to speak with audiences of parents as well as counselors across the country to inform them about what the latest changes are. And of course, as we've seen with the pandemic, I think one of the elements most clearly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic is the inability to test, and colleges wholesale adopting some flavor of test optional policy, which has caused a lot of confusion about
and anxiety. I think it's made things worse in some ways.
Yeah. And in some, I'd like to think the positive, more optimistic side of myself is thinking this is going to give students more autonomy. They're going to feel more liberated. The other part that we're still trying to figure out is now there's this extra wrinkle in the process and determining whether or not to submit scores and what constitutes a score that is good enough. So we'll explore some of those things today. To get to that question, Mary Pat, as far as like the proportion of students that regularly tested and submitted scores in the past, it's almost completely related to testing requirements that were used by most colleges for decades. So prior to the pandemic, let's say even 2018, 2019, around the 416 or so colleges that Compass surveys annually, where we track their admissions policies, testing data, what I'll show you in a little bit, their average score ranges, those scores that most students end up achieving and end up matriculating at those schools. About 2/3 of those colleges were requiring the SAT or ACT. And students mostly didn't want to foreclose on the opportunity of applying to a school, the vast majority of them probably on their list, that needed to have a test score in order for you to be eligible for admission. Even though about 1/3 of those colleges within our list had some flavor of a test optional policy. But I would say that test optional back then, even just a few years ago, apart from a small selection of liberal arts colleges that could do, I think, a much more deep and quote holistic review where test scores weren't as necessary, you could kind of get away with not having them, especially if application pools were a lot smaller. Yeah. But I think that other folks were kind of suspicious and not really sure. And I think that has been compounded because of the volume and the variety of colleges that are now test optional. So yeah, in the past, it was kind of like your hippier schools. I know when I went to UC Santa Cruz for undergrad, there was a time where the UCs, or Santa Cruz specifically, I don't think cared about test scores. And then also students could get narrative evaluations instead of grades and all kinds of stuff. You don't see that happening at larger institutions and state institutions more regularly, and also more selective schools. So that's kind of, we're at this interesting, although it's incredibly widespread, it is an anomaly as far as the history of these exams is concerned.
So what percentage then during the do you have any numbers like as to like what percentage of students did submit test scores in the last 2 years?
The data that I have is from the Common App, which is one of the most common platforms that students use to submit test scores. And I believe that for the first year, it had gone all the way down to around 37% of applicants were applying with scores. Now that has changed already just in the last year with test sites resuming and becoming more plentiful. And we saw that increase to about 53% thus far for the class of 2022. So it's rebounding, but it's certainly not what we saw pre-pandemic, where again, you would probably see 70, 80%.
Yeah, that's what I remember hearing.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, because it's a year past the first year, and people need to understand colleges release what they want to release. They don't always share information. But here's my question. So I've heard that test optional schools fall into 3 categories: test neutral, test aware, and test preferred. What do those terms mean, and how can a student or a parent try to figure out which way a school's going with that?
Yeah, so this is Mary Pat, where you mentioned.
I know this is a tough one.
This is the whole crystal ball thing where honestly, I wish that I could get out my crystals and tarot cards and be like, aha, I'm going to direct you to exactly the right decision to be made. And yes, I think what we're seeing is what I would call a spectrum of optionality around those colleges, around 95 to 97% of colleges across the country that claim that they're test optional, but depending on the language that appears on their admissions websites, I might say in some cases, they tacitly encourage having these exams. In other cases, they are a little bit more neutral. So maybe test aware, I think is the term that you used, where an exam might be additive if it's included, if it aligns with the rest of the academic portfolio. Or they really don't care. They're kind of what I call test meh, like it doesn't really add anything extra. I know even perhaps some super selective colleges, Cornell with some of its degree programs and colleges on campus has actually gone test-free. This is another term that I'll come out and discuss a little bit later, which means that a student doesn't necessarily even have the opportunity to apply with the test score. They're actually struck from the record entirely. A student cannot apply to a specific program or school with tests.
Yeah,
right?
they black them out, right?
That's right. That's right. So I'm going to quickly share my screen just to show you kind of what the existing landscape looks like. And I also just want to quickly throw out here before I jump ahead. Mary Pat, I know I'm not in presenter mode, but can you see my PowerPoint deck? Okay.
Yeah.
So folks, in addition to the recording that we're keeping for you tonight, I also want to just throw out a resource, and I'll put it in the chat as well. This is, I think, the most comprehensive resource of its kind on testing information that Compass aggregates semi-annually. We have a brand new digital version that just came out. It's over 100 pages of all of this insider testing policy information, speculation about the future. We have other little interesting tidbits about which colleges, for example, super score or allow score choice. There's some funny things in the submission of test scores that we might have time to discuss this evening if there's interest. We also go into the nooks and crannies of these exams themselves if you're interested in trying to ferret out the difference between the most popular exams, the SAT and the ACT that students are selecting from, all right? So don't feel like you need to take major notes. A lot of this is covered within these resources, and I'm gonna go ahead and pop this link into the chat. It's super easy. It's just compassprep.com/guide, all right? Now, to come back here, I'm gonna go into full screen. So for the class of 2022, again, graduating seniors, this is what we saw up until right about now. Some of these numbers have changed a little bit as some colleges have kicked the can down the road, extending their test optional policies. You may have heard Harvard made some waves by extending, I think, through 2025 or 2026. And we're doing our best to maintain our list. But at this point, you can see that the vast majority of folks out there are within the either test optional temporary or permanent camps, right? The anomalies are those that are requiring the SAT and ACT and those that are test free. And if we look at the states geographically.
I was gonna say it's spice. Because what happens is the state governments, some states made rules that said we're going to be, like Colorado said, we're not going to require them anymore. And Florida and Georgia said, we require them. So yeah, it's so strange. Most colleges, though, I think we're like, we want to do what's karmically right for students. I'm curious, Mary Pat, what your experience was counseling students in Seattle, because especially in 2021, I know it was so hard to find a testing site. Yeah, I mean, pretty much any student who didn't test before March of 2020, you couldn't test here. You know, other states, it wasn't a big deal, you could test. Most of my students didn't have test scores. Very few did. And it's interesting, you know, we were talking about test neutral, and just so people understand, at least, and Matty, tell me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but when I hear the term test neutral, which you said test meh, which I like that too, it just means it didn't make a student submitting test scores or not submitting test scores. Students were accepted pretty much at the same rate. It didn't change, you know, versus with test aware, if this college released the numbers, and that's always the big thing, a higher percentage of students were accepted who had test scores than who didn't have test scores. Yeah, well, you know what, Mary Pat, I wish it was actually that clear cut, because what seems clear cut, though, is so colleges are taking a very specific stance in their language, but they're actually not always sharing the data as far as admissions outcomes when students are submitting or withholding scores. So you're right. If we were looking at schools, and by the way, they don't have on their admissions websites, we are a test additive or test neutral school. No, they don't. Or, you know, or we are a test preferred school. Sometimes admissions will tell you, though. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's where I think you need to get to answer that question that you said, like, how do you get a sense of these policies? And you really do, unfortunately, need to look a little bit closely at the colleges that are on your list. For the vast majority of schools out there, I would say they have a public-facing stance that is additive or neutral. And usually it's framed as, quote,
those without test scores, and this is what UVA is saying, will not be penalized during our holistic review process. Or what Tulane mentions, if the applicant feels that their SAT or ACT score accurately reflects their academic aptitude, we welcome them to submit their scores. Now, that sounds great, but I kind of am suspicious, you know, because and I'm sure you may have seen this too, Mary Pat, there's only been a little bit of data that colleges that have shared. I think Tulane is one of them, but most are very tight-lipped about what the outcomes were, and if there perhaps was an advantage to students applying with scores. And I would say that it's much clearer for schools like this, Carleton, the University of Chicago, Northwestern, more selective colleges that will state very plainly on U of Chicago, which actually went test optional before the pandemic. So they're an interesting case here. We encourage students to take standardized tests like the SAT and ACT, and we anticipate that the vast majority of students will continue to take these exams and submit them, okay? So this is an example of a college, all of these on this list, where although you're totally eligible for admission, and I would argue that at its core, test optional means that your application is complete with or without a test score, right? But then you have to make a tactical decision about in what ways can your application be behooved by sharing a result. And in this case, applying to these schools, I don't know, Mary Pat, what do you think? Is it probably, do you think most of your students are going to be applying? Let's say there's ample testing available. There's no more pandemic stuff.
Right.
What are you saying to your students in this case, if they're applying to a school that is clearly like
if they're applying to these type of schools, I would say absolutely. Again, if they're applying to the University of Washington, which even though it's technically test optional, they're pretty much test blind, except in very small cases. You know, again, it depends on the student's list. I do make a joke, and I think I said this to you when we were practicing. So the test preferred colleges, and I saw this a number of times last year. So when students apply to colleges, there's a whole bunch of different things they can ask for, and one is a supplemental essay question. And I've seen schools who did in 800 words, please tell us why you're not submitting.
You didn't test, oh my gosh.
And so, I mean, seriously, 800 words, tell us why. And it's like, okay. So if you see questions like that, that's a school that wants test scores. Let me tell you.
If you're making me jump through this like flaming hoop, this is ridiculous. And I even like to kind of turn the prism and look even more closely. I thought this was really interesting data from the University of Illinois, and I doubt they're like that interesting of a school for students in the Pacific Northwest.
Actually, no, they are. Oh, no, you are wrong, because they have a really good computer science program. I had lots of students apply to Urbana.
Okay. So that's interesting. And that actually goes in line with what I'm going to show you. So there can even be variances among submission trends within a single institution, especially if it has other, again, engineering programs, certain colleges and majors.
Science,
So here you can see for the class of 2025, we have their median SAT scores below. And
this is not high school students class of 25, it's the college class of 25.
That's right, yes, right. And thank you for clarifying that. So you can see that clearly, not to besmirch the great College of Social Work, but it's clearly less important. Same with fine and applied arts. Most students aren't applying with test scores, or if they are, they're much lower than their colleagues that are applying to the engineering school, which is far and away the most popular. And you're seeing on average, 80% of students submitting scores are getting close to a 1500, close to the 96th percentile on the SAT. So this, I think, shows how this has become a bit more complicated than we'd like to think. And it's not just a zero sum.
That's one of our later questions, was specifically to STEM majors, which we have a lot in this area. So good slide.
Well, maybe that's actually a good question maybe to follow up with, Mary Pat.
You want me to do that one now?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it mostly goes in line with what I'm showing here.
Okay. All right. Standardized test scores do play a role in admissions. Can you talk about the role they play for STEM majors? And you were just showing us with Urbana. What about for merit aid? Do test scores lead to more scholarship money? I've been hearing talk about while some colleges may not look at the ACT or SAT because they can't, like the UCs, and so their hands are tied. But for admission purposes, AP scores might be very helpful. What can you talk about? What have you heard about this?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm going to throw up another slide. So first off, I guess when we talk about STEM programs and students applying to
And there's
competitive
different, there's
colleges,
students who are pre-med, and then there's students who are engineering and computer science, and but we do have a lot of them here in Lake Washington School District. So
yeah. I think in some ways I've noticed historically that there tends to be this assumption that students applying to these more selective colleges and programs where there's just fewer spaces available, that higher scores on the SAT or ACT, what used to be more essential in the past, you may have heard of something called the subject
I was
test.
going to say they got rid of
away.
subject tests a couple of years ago.
Yeah, folks,
Those were
unaware.
Those were almost always required for engineering schools and computer science.
Yeah, and there were these like 1 hour topical exams all the way from your sciences, your physics, your chem. They had something called Math 2, which was basically pre-calculus, and also your humanities and foreign languages. And students that were applying to more competitive STEM programs in particular were trying to gain any incremental advantage possible, and often submitting these very lightweight hour-long subject test scores. You can also imagine that in addition to an SAT or ACT, maybe we can discuss this later, APs are an interesting way to distinguish oneself, even in the absence of an SAT or an ACT result. And in some ways, an AP exam might be seen as more favorable and demonstrative, of kind of more comprehensive mastery of a subject than just the basic stuff that you might be seeing on an SAT or ACT. But to talk about merit, I have one silly little slide that I'm just going to pop up here.
Well, and I can tell you, I know one of my seniors this year had applied to a school, and it was test optional, and I don't know why he didn't submit his test scores, but he didn't. And he got admitted, and they gave him some merit aid, but he did get a letter from admissions saying, hey, if you have test scores, we might have more money for you. So
that's interesting.
Yeah,
I've heard that it's probably a little bit of an overstatement, but that good test scores can help earn admission, but great test scores can earn rewards. It's kind of, though, I would say you can't have your cake and eat it too. That maybe there are some colleges that have committed, and this used to be much more significant decades ago with, let's say, the National Merit Scholarship Corporation, and students based on their 11th grade PSAT scores end up going on to qualify as semifinalists, finalists, or scholars, and just gobs of money were thrown at them to attend. University of Oklahoma was a very clear example. They gave out full tuition and often touted having more National Merit scholars than any other institution.
Alabama kind of like that too, right?
Yep. I think that mostly the majority of colleges have disentangled their relationship with merit aid and test scores. And it's usually those schools that are less selective tend to give out more aid than schools that are more selective, just because at more selective schools, high test scores are more and more common.
Right.
So this is just an example. So there's a small college in the Midwest, Hope College. Auburn University is an anomaly, obviously in Alabama, popular school, gives out a little bit more aid and actually makes its admissions decisions pretty explicitly looking at that matrix of GPA and test scores.
Test scores. Yeah, absolutely.
That's basically it for them. Hofstra, I don't know if anyone has heard of that one. These schools, Boston University, as well as the University of Wisconsin-Madison, fall maybe into that test additive neutral group, but you're not seeing, again, massive aid. University of Florida is an interesting outlier, and there are some larger state colleges and their associated state scholarship funds. In Florida, there's something known as the Bright Futures Scholarship. And students who, based on an academic index, get a particular GPA and a grade, they immediately get something like $10,000 of aid per year for a state college that they're applying to.
You have to be a resident, though, for that, don't you?
That's right. It's for native Floridians.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yes. And then these other schools, Grinnell and all of the Ivy League colleges, offer exactly $0 whatsoever. All right. So that's why we always try to keep into perspective the value of these exams relative to other features of the application.
I always remind families that the term merit scholarship, merit aid, it's a tuition discount to attract students to attend.
Yes.
And the schools that are down there in your lower quadrant there, they don't need to do anything, they don't need to do anything to attract students. If you don't want that spot, there's somebody standing behind you who will gladly take it. So
I just saw a question, Mary Pat, that I don't know the answer to, that popped in the Q&A.
Okay,
it's from a parent who asked, do you need scores to get
WUI
money?
Yeah, okay.
And maybe you can explain
good,
what WUI
good question.
is.
Okay, so WUI it stands for the Western Undergraduate Exchange. So, and I will be doing a very in-depth webinar on March 15th on my College 101, and we'll talk more about WUI. But there's a difference between in-state tuition and out-of-state tuition. And the only in-state tuition typically you're going to get is Washington. So any of the other 49 states is out of state. And out-of-state tuition typically is 3 times in-state tuition. So it's pretty expensive. So WUI schools, there's 14 states. Washington is one of them, California, Oregon, Montana, blah, blah, blah. And they have agreements between these states that instead of the 3 times in-state tuition for out-of-state students, it's 1.5 times. So it's a huge cost savings. However, it's not all the public schools. And there's a website. If you just type in WUE on your search engine, it'll pop up. So prior to the pandemic, some schools had sliding scales, like if you had a certain GPA and then a certain test score, you could qualify. Some schools, there was just, like this GPA, this test score. But with the pandemic, a lot of schools had to, I think pretty much all of them, I can't think of anybody who was still requiring test scores for WUI. But WUI is on an availability standpoint, like, it's state funded and budgets. And so it's not readily available everywhere. And this is not a diss to Boise State, but Boise State was requiring a 3.9 GPA for WUI this year, which I have to say, I was shocked because, again, as far as a selectivity, it's not the most selective school, and that's a pretty high rate. So the answer is right. For the class of 22, I haven't seen anybody requiring test scores for WUI. It can change though. And again, that's why, as I said, there's no magic answer to this, but like I've been telling all my students, I think it's a good idea to have at least one test score because you might need it for something like WUI. So
yeah, and that dovetails with our advising to Mary Pat. I think that for the majority of our students, unless you know for certain that your student is only applying to colleges that are clearly what again, as I said earlier, test meh.
Like if a student is saying, for a lot of reasons, I'm only applying to in-state schools. We have 6 in the state of Washington: UW, Washington State, Western Washington, Eastern Washington, Central Washington, and then Evergreen. Okay, none of them are going to look at test scores. None of them. So if that's where you're applying, they're all great schools. You don't need a test score.
That's right.
If you're applying to the UCs, Cal State, they're not looking at them. So,
I was going to say, the UCs really made waves.
I have to say most of the West Coast schools are still really, most of, now Stanford, that's a different story. But that's a different animal. Let's keep going with our questions, Rose. We're going to run out of time here.
Great.
Okay. So, okay. So while most of the class of 21, at least here in the Seattle area, didn't have test scores, students from the class of 22 had a lot more opportunity. What I noticed is that students would pick and choose which colleges received their test scores. Typically, students only sent strong test scores, which skews the scores for students who are applying next year. Because what happens is they look at the previous year's test scores, right? Anyways, what advice do you have for handling this? I've heard of looking back a couple of years to see if your scores are good, but you tell me what you say.
Yeah, that's a really great and an astute observation, because we've seen parents panicking. So just to make this very clear, one, there were 2 things that happened as a result, mostly I think driven by the test optional movement. One, massive applicant glut, like ballooning application pools, right? All over.
Mostly to the most selective schools.
Yes,
though.
mostly to more selected colleges. And you often actually saw declines. There's now a crisis, for example, among community colleges
Right.
nationally.
Yes, exactly.
They're seeing their enrollments drop and less interest in applying to those.
Yeah, I just saw that the University of California system saw like a 19% drop in transfer students from community colleges. That's huge.
Massive. And but I'm curious.
The headlines are all NYU over 100,000 applications. UCLA got the most applications ever of anybody last year. So everybody hears those. But anyways, keep talking. I'm sorry.
No. It's totally fine. So again, excluding maybe schools that are from that regional list, in-state to Washington, California, test-free institutions, you're probably not exactly sure if you're a sophomore or junior. All of the institutions that are going to appear on your college list by the time you apply as a senior, you're going to chat with your parents, your college counselors, perhaps Mary Pat, and suddenly things start coming together. You evolve as a person, your interests change, and your list may have adapted. And you might have a list that now has some schools that are requiring an SAT or ACT, some that are, quote, test preferred and would like to have a result, and others that, it's fine without, and you decide to omit those results. But the point is, you want to be able to exercise that choice of whether or not to submit, and only be left with schools where you can't have, or excuse me, Mary Pat, where did my brain just go? You don't want to be left with, I guess, like a foreclosure of options just because you decided to sidestep testing entirely.
And you have to have a balanced list, and it's fine. And because part of it is there's more to the college application than standardized test scores. All right, it's a data point, and again, just we're all different. Some people are standardized testing is like breathing. God bless those kids, not me. But there are people who they get it, and other people it would take. I don't even know how much work, and we're going to talk. That's actually one of our questions. But you kind of have to decide what's right for the student. I don't want anybody spending 100 hours on standardized testing or $10,000 to try to improve their test scores. Sorry, Matty, since you are a test prep company.
$10,000 is a little insane.
Yes, I know. But there's places around here. I hear stories like that from parents.
I'm sure. I realize I ignored your question though, Mary Pat. So with the increase of applications, you also saw more students applying than ever before without scores, which again, when you then have this rarefied number of students applying with scores, they're only going to send in that information if they feel like it's additive, if those scores are high enough. And thus, what would have normally brought down the averages reported by colleges on the SATs and ACTs, the rising tide brought up all ships. And at first glance, it would appear that you need to have a higher score than ever before to be admissible. And I'm saying this is just the result of an anomaly that we're seeing in the classes of 2021 and 2022. And what you had mentioned that I think is really great guidance is look back a few years. What was a good score 3 or 4 years ago before the pandemic is how
can people find test scores previous years? Like just do a Google search of admitted student test scores for the class of 2020 or something. Like I don't, and I'm actually asking you this question because when I look it up, it's always current. But how do you look up old test scores or ranges?
So you can do a couple of things.
I know the common data set is one way. Most colleges have something called a common data set. They're the most boring things you've ever read. And personally, I find them so boring to read. I do them sometimes. They're these huge documents. I don't even know how many pages that they are, but it's like a government form, and it's probably in there, and they do it by year, but they're very tedious reading. It's like a legal document. I don't like
Yeah, and lots of spreadsheets and just gnarly data. So the first thing I'd recommend that you do is chat with your school's counselor, because they likely have historical data depending on the software that they've used. They'll look at if they have Naviance, if they have SCORE. I don't know what most like Washington public schools.
Oh, are you talking about the school counselor? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So our district does not use Naviance or Score. And
Okay.
I'm not a parent anymore in the district, so I don't know we have Skyward, and I'm sure there's all sorts of information in there. I thought you meant to ask the college admissions person, which you could.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just so everybody knows, sometimes people think you can't talk to admissions people, or they're gonna think, like make a mark in the book, like, oh, don't admit this person because they asked us questions. They don't do that. They love talking to people. So
yeah,
okay.
yeah. So yes, that's actually probably one of the easiest things to do, is to just call the Office of Admissions and find out what their reported averages were.
You're right.
In
Now,
those years
if
prior.
we had Naviance or Score, that would be a good thing.
Yeah. So, but you might be able to get that historical information from your high school counselors, specifically the college advising office, if maybe they've tracked where their students have gone to colleges, what scores they achieved, and whether or not they were admitted to X colleges. Okay. But you actually can even just put in class of whatever the previous year was, class of 2020, class of 2019, and test scores in the name of the college.
Right, average admitted student test scores, because what you're looking for is the 50th percentile of test scores. And the rule of thumb is, if a student's scores fall within the 50th percentile or are better, you would submit your scores. If they're below, you don't want to send them because they can't unsee it. Unless it's right, again, if it's a highly selective school and your scores for anybody else would be excellent, again, I usually tell kids to send them in, especially this past year. I said, send them in, you should be proud of those. So.
So this is kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but I think it gets at one of the questions that you were asking, Mary Pat, as far as what did we learn from the class of 2021 and the dribs and drabs of information that we're getting from colleges about the class of 2022. So in spite of, again, this air of egalitarianism, the spirit of not disadvantaging any student who couldn't test, what did we look at? What data did we find? What trends in admissions outcomes and test scores? And if you follow this chart here, on the x-axis, you see a list of colleges, and then the y-axis, you see the admit rate percentages. Focus on the different bars. You see there's a solid bar that's colored, which means that's with test. If there's a gradient bar, that's the admit rate without test.
Okay.
Those closer to the y-axis on the left, all right, are those colleges that saw more parity in admit rates with and without scores. So I would argue that, let's say a school like Northeastern, in their test optional language, I would say they're clearly a test additive or test neutral school. They say if it helps your application, if you want us to see your scores, there's something you're proud of, then by all means share. And fortunately, we're seeing absolute equilibrium, just evenness in admit rates among students with and without scores. So they're definitely walking their talk. However, I mentioned University of Virginia earlier. All the way at the end, you can see schools like Emory, Colgate, and Georgia Tech, where the admit rate without test scores is dwarfed by the admit rate with scores. And you can even add this multiplier coefficient to it. You might be, I think, you might want to say here that you're twice as likely, or over twice as likely to get into X school with a test score in these cases. And that's a little bit of an oversimplification here. We don't know anything about the nature of the test scores that are being shared according to this chart, right? If I were to take two data points from this, or two conclusions that I would draw, would be one, I think that a high test score in most cases is more advantageous than not submitting any score whatsoever, all right? And secondarily, that oftentimes high testers have other correlative features in their application that make them desirable. So higher test takers also tend to have higher GPAs. They tend to be at schools with greater resources, have access to extracurriculars, closer relationships with teachers, personal statements, and letters of recommendation. So you can kind of see where, in some ways, also test scores were, I think, unfairly leaned into because they became this proxy for assuming all of these other things about a student. And I think actually that's where the impetus for test optional should really lie.
Yeah.
It's about making sure that tests are being utilized and evaluated efficiently, and not necessarily that tests are simply good or bad and that
Right.
the instrument should be thrown out entirely. But I could, take my soapbox elsewhere and talk about that later.
So I'd like to respond to a couple of questions that we've had from the audience. So somebody was asking about whether or not doing running start, which is dual enrollment, Matty, helps a student for the, like, do you not need test scores? So running start's a great program. And again, it depends on where a student is applying to. If you're applying in the Pacific Northwest, the West Coast, most colleges are fine. They love running start. UW loves running start. Gonzaga loves running, they're all good. Now, if you apply to school on the East Coast, they might say, well, they not necessarily know what it is. However, the point is, even as a running start student, even if a student does all the work and does a junior year and senior year and completes their associate degree by the time they graduate from high school, they still have to apply to college as if they're a freshman. So the test scores with or without running start are going to have, it's exactly the same. It doesn't, doing running start doesn't mean, oh, you don't need test scores because you're applying as a transfer student. It doesn't mean that so the same approach. The other question somebody asked was, what about if a student had learning differences with, and maybe they don't test well. And there's so many people who don't test well. And and that's why it was kind of like a perfect storm with the start of the pandemic, with all these people for years have been saying this, test scores, aren't fair and they're not reasonable and level, whatever. So a couple things. So you can get accommodations, like if a student has a learning difference and they qualify for time and a half in the classroom, they have a 504 or an IEP. If they get accommodations in the high school, they are supposed to get accommodations for standardized testing. You do it through the College Board or through the ACT. You do it through your school system. They have to take care of it. You have to have everything documented, T's crossed, I's dotted. You can't just be like, oh, the pediatrician says my child has a, no, it's got to be official. But anyways, that being said, so on most college applications, there is a spot that says, hey, is there anything else you want us to know? And there is nothing wrong. And I've had kids do this because learning difference, the kids can do great in school. It just, again, it's the standardized testing part of it. Again, the round peg in a square hole or whatever, is to simply say, I mean, you could submit them if you want, if you took them, but again, this is where you got to make that decision. Does it make, like, how much improvement can you do, and how much stress and anxiety and time and that a student could be spent doing something more productive than this test score. Anyways, but just like, I chose not to take standardized test scores because I have a learning difference and I did some practice tests and it wasn't ever going to be good enough. But look at my grades, look at my accomplishments, look at my activities, read my essay, like find out what a wonderful person I am, read my letters of rec. So then that's what I like about this test optional thing, is that again, it is test optional. And even if some schools really want them, there are kids who get admitted without them too, because there's more than just this. I hate people being defined by a number. It just irks me. So
yeah, no, I can relate on a personal level. Usually during presentations like this, I share that for my graduate school experience, in order to get into my master's program,
GMAT or GRE?
Yeah, I needed a GRE.
Yeah.
And I scored in the 15th percentile on both the math and verbal sections of my GRE. I was just nervous as all get out on those exams, just underperformed. And even my undergrad advisors that wrote my letters of recommendation even mentioned, like, please pay no heed to Matty's GRE scores. They're not reflective of their potential.
And that's what I have to say. It's just not reflective of my ability. And there's other places you can prove that. So
yeah. Right. And the moral of that story, by the way, was that I got a full ride to the University of Chicago. So
good for you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So it's definitely still possible. And also, I'll just throw out there one more thing. There's no way for colleges to know whether or not you took an SAT or an ACT with
Right.
accommodations. It's
Right.
not, there's no special
Yeah.
asterisk or anything. So you won't be identified unless you self-report elsewhere in your application.
Yeah. And
that
again,
you have
that's
some
totally
kind of a
up.
disability. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And okay. I want to make sure we keep going on this, or else
Cool.
we have all these wonderful questions that we work so hard on. Okay. So, and this kind of ties into this. And you and I talked about this. The remote learning, oh my God, last year has really impacted students. It's showing up in some of the SBA testing that they've done and things like that. But anyways, what is a realistic gain in scores for students, starting with the PSAT? And so everybody, you probably know this, but in the Lake Washington district, 10th graders take the PSAT. They have everyone do it. The scores don't go anywhere. It's just to introduce students to standardized testing. And the P stands for preliminary. I like to call it practice, but someone corrected me. So, all right, it's preliminary. Anyways, we're starting with those baselines there, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So in order to improve a score, what's required with time and effort? And I get it. Everybody wants 99th percentile. I wanted my kids to get them too. They didn't. Okay. But what's realistic, and what from a time, and we'll talk. The next question is going to be how without hiring a test prep company, which is certainly a way to do it, but how else can people prepare for these tests?
Yeah. Fortunately, there's an embarrassment of riches when it comes to different ways to prepare for these exams. And I think you can get really adequate, not even adequate, that makes it sound worse, but you can get like really great results.
Snob. Come on.
Yeah, I know. You can get great results from any number of modalities of test preparation. I'll start with this idea of what constitutes like a good or reasonable score improvement with a reasonable amount
like what's
of effort.
reasonable and how much,
Yeah. So two things, and I like that you mentioned this earlier, Mary Pat, about like everyone wants the 99th percentile. So it's important to, it's important to bear in mind, that's right, that these exams are unlike how tests are scored in school, where oftentimes you'll hear about like a curve being set by how the individual class performs, and one gnarly student breaks the curve and got a perfect score and the whole class rebels and is really mad. These exams are norm referenced, meaning that the distribution of scores is intended to stay stable year over year. And they try in the chemistry of these exams, how they build the questions, to pull the same students to basically correct and incorrect answer choices, so that most students on a good test form are performing about, on the average range on the SAT or ACT, and then fewer students are performing less well, fewer students performing exceptionally well. Just to give you a visual of this, I'm going to share my screen. So right now, I know SAT tends to be on everyone's minds in the Pacific Northwest, but ACT is also incredibly popular. And also, by the way, there is no preference for one test or the other.
That's one of our questions too, is everybody, and it's always regional. Like I grew up in the Midwest, and Midwest was more ACT, but I took them both. And California is very SAT oriented, and I think people out here think it's SAT, but it's whichever test you do better on. That's the one you want to take.
Absolutely. So what do I want to say here? If we go back, we look at the construction of these exams, although this is the ACT scale out of 36, I could just as easily transpose the distribution of SAT scores out of 1600, and the shape is almost identical. You'd see this lovely bell, okay? And two things that I like to mention. One, not every student is meant to get a perfect score, with exams engineered to reproduce these outcomes. And simultaneously, endless effort does not yield endless reward with test prep, that you do hit the land of diminishing returns, that most students, after that baseline score that you were mentioning, Mary Pat, on like a PSAT, some students want to be even more fastidious and will take a full-length practice SAT or ACT with a test prep company like Compass. You can even do this by downloading exams for free on the College Board website, or purchasing. Both ACT and College Board have manuals of retired exams that you can take and get the results and everything, right? So there's numbers of different ways to do this. Although I think most companies out there will make these broad proclamations and say, every student should improve their scores by 3 or 4 composite points on the ACT, or we're looking for 150 to 200 points on the SAT. That might make sense for the vast majority of students who are clustered toward the middle of the distribution, or perhaps even toward the bottom. Less so, I would say that margin of improvement is as reasonable for a student that's doing exceptionally well already on an SAT or ACT. And just to illustrate that idea, I'm going to pull up this slide with some fun little animations. All right. So here's that same ACT chart. And I'm going to go ahead and map on the percentile values for each of these scores on the range 1 to 36. And let's say, as an example, I started at a 19 on a practice ACT. It's far less common across the US, but there is technically a pre-ACT that some schools administer, which is meant to be a mirror image of the PSAT. All right. So here you have a kiddo at a 19, which is the equivalent of the 44th percentile. All right. Okay. A little heuristic that we use, a kind of shortcut at Compass to help us determine what's a reasonable increment of improvement, is to, there I am looking cute, and I'm at the 44th place in line, basically in a line of 100 people. Okay. What we usually try to do with test prep is help us cross the distance in front of us by 1/2. All right. So to improve by, not 50%, but basically to get ahead of half of the people in front of us. In that case, if we do that for the ACT, that brings us to the 73rd place in line, which if we go we look at the composite score, that would be a 5-point improvement. That would be a really great improvement for us and not unreasonable to achieve. Right. However, let's say we're already a quote, what I would say a native tester. Okay. And we're already at a 29, which is the 91st percentile. We see us standing in line again, and most of the folks behind us are behind us at this point, and crossing the group in front of us by 1/2, cutting that distance in absolute terms doesn't look as impactful, but it's actually just as significant. So I would say a student moving from the 91st to the 95th position, 2 points of improvement is just as significant as the 5 points mentioned earlier, where far more students are clustered and huddled together. All right. So generally, it's just to say that if you run into a test prep company that is promising you the moon, that says we can guarantee X result, and they're not being relative about improvements based on where a student's starting score is, they don't understand how these exams work and where that diminishing return happens. So,
well, that was great animation. So, so we talked a little bit about how to prepare, and I always have opinions about everything. My thing is, I think, and exactly what you're saying with taking standard or practice tests, getting, on Amazon for less than $20, you can get ACT book, SAT book with retired tests for $20, and all that. I think familiarity with materials can be very helpful. Khan Academy is a free online, and just so, because we did, I did take that little in the beginning, and we're pretty even, not as many ninth graders. There's a lot of juniors and a lot of sophomores. And little tip, in case anybody doesn't know this. So Khan Academy and College Board do work together to try to provide free test prep services, and Khan Academy does APs, and they do. Khan Academy is a great organization. Anyways, when you get your PSAT results, whether you get it in 10th grade or you get it in junior year, in the front, I should have brought this up, but there's some like a 15-digit code, and it's specific to a student. And if you go on to Khan Academy, and if you plug in that code that's on the front of your PSAT report, it knows what you got right and what you got wrong on the PSAT, and it will personalize a free study guide for you. So I think that's a really valuable service.
Incredibly, yes.
And I'm also, like I said, I'm not a fan of some test prep companies, and I won't say their names here because I don't want to get sued or anything like that. But what I always say, what a good tutor does, and I am more of a fan, I'm not a fan of classes. And the reason is because they have to go to the lowest common denominator in the class. And I think a student is better served. And I know from my own children's experience, sometimes it's just maybe 5 sessions is all that you need but what a good tutor does, in my opinion, is teach a student how to take the test, because this is supposed to be material that a typical junior in high school knows, whether it be the ACT or the SAT. Kids are supposed to know this. Now they might, you might need a little refresher on certain things, but back in my day, and I'm a dinosaur, you didn't study. You took it once, whatever you got, you got. And you're like, yeah, okay, probably it was a good idea that I didn't go out the night before, before I took the test and stuff like that. But and I do always, and a couple other things, and this is just me kind of, but if you are going to work with a tutor one-on-one, make sure they give you the same tutor every time, because some of these companies, they'll switch them around every single time. And you have to have continuity with the tutor, because otherwise they don't know how the student is preparing. And the other thing is, I always say, make sure your student likes the tutor, because teenagers, if they don't like somebody, they're never going to do anything that the tutor says. Anyways, okay. Okay, so let's answer this question here. Which you answered, do colleges have a preference between the ACT and SAT? No, they don't care. It's whichever one you do best. And again, what I typically recommend, so, in the fall, the PSAT was taken, you get the results back around in December sometime. I think that's an excellent time, whether it be junior year or sophomore year, doesn't matter, taking a practice ACT around the same time. Would you agree with me? I guess we didn't talk about this, but do you agree, Matty, that that's kind of a good time to take a practice ACT to see how they do, or do you have different advice for that?
So I'll streamline the testing timeline for most folks. This is just best practices at Compass, and some folks
and then can you also just talk briefly about because while the tests are very similar, they are different. So
so let's first let's take out the idea of prepping for one test or the other, SAT or ACT. Let's treat them like they're identical twins at this point.
Okay.
Right? So you make your decision maybe based on taking practice tests. And what most students that we recommend that they do is, and by the way, I just saw this pop up in the chat, where do you take a practice ACT? I'll include information about this in a second. It's something that Compass offers.
And again, just because I want to make sure that we're being broad in all this. So companies like Compass offer them, some are free, some are self-proctored, blah, blah, blah. Yep. A lot of the test prep companies in the area do. You can also, again, you can buy a test prep booklet from Amazon, and a parent could proctor it themselves. The answer key's in the back. You don't have to know the answers yourself. But there's a lot of different ways to proctor, to take a practice test.
That's right.
It's easiest just to do it through a company like Compass or someplace like that, because they'll do it for you. But
that's right.
There are other options.
Yeah.
And and a lot of times they're free, right, Matty?
So we offer for students, if you are not with a virtual proctor, so someone is either, well, I would say virtual or in-person. We offer some in-person practice tests in Bellevue on a monthly basis.
Okay.
And then also virtually proctored exams, kind of like how we're dialed in right now.
Yeah.
Every weekend for students on Saturday and Sunday, where they are guided through the disembodied head of a lovely proctor like me. All right. So, but to answer that first question that you had just about timeline and when students are taking these exams and practice tests and when that all happens, I would say that fall through late winter of 11th grade, so even around right now, is a great time to take practice, either a practice SAT to compare with a practice ACT, or the PSAT and compare it with a practice ACT, and see if your student has a preference. It might come out in the scores themselves, or it might simply be a matter of preference, because as Mary Pat was acknowledging earlier, there are some differences that are quite obvious. The ACT, for example, covers more geometry than the SAT. The cadence and rhythm of these exams, generally the ACT moves more quickly, but is more straightforward in the way it sets up questions for students, whereas the SAT, although gives you more seconds per individual question, it comes at the expense of more dense reading passages. So although most students tend to perform about the same on these
Mhm.
exams,
Yeah.
when it comes to sitting for the assessments, they might feel a little bit different. All right.
Oh, and can we say that no one should be taking the optional essay? I know
That's
the
right.
SAT doesn't offer it anymore, but the ACT is still offering.
Yeah,
the
ignore
essay.
the optional essay
Yes,
on the
no one
ACT.
needs that. No
Mhm,
one needs
mhm.
that. It's an extra hour of your life you can't get back. So
That's right.
don't do it.
And I would say that most students plan to sit for a first official SAT or ACT in the spring of 11th grade. And then after that test, determine if either, they like their score, it
Yep.
fits for the majority of schools that they're
Mhm.
applying to, great. I would say most students plan to sit for these exams at least twice before they end up applying to colleges in the
Mhm.
fall of their senior year.
And they do offer them in the summer. They offer them all year now.
That's right.
which is
That's
nice.
right. Yeah, there's plenty of opportunities to sit for these exams, but 2 tends to be the sweet spot. And I would say
It used to be
really,
a lot higher. Remember the kids who would take it like 6 or 7
I
times?
know it's ridiculous. But if I could make a general rule that I think extends to the vast majority of students out there, is that you should not be engaging in any formal test preparation whatsoever before 11th grade.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah. If a test prep company tries to wrangle you into doing test preparation, any score improvement that you see is truly about what the student is learning in their coursework and their maturity as mathematicians and readers. And it's not because of how they're learning to take the test, maybe a small increment of that, right? Well, we want students to be able to be fully baked and then ready to take these exams when they've completely matured, and then learning some of the strategy and things like that Mary Pat was mentioning earlier, right? So that's my general guidance, I would say, for when to sit for these tests and kind of when to prep and practice testing. And things like
We
that.
got 2 more questions and
Yeah.
I'd like to get to them and then we'll see what questions we didn't answer here. Okay, so the class of 25, that's this year's freshmen, they get the new SAT.
Mhm.
What can you tell us about that? Any word if the ACT will be changing? They're supposed to change in the fall of 2019 and then COVID hit and nothing ever happened with that. So
Yeah.
what can you tell the class of, so poor class of 24 and 23, sorry, you guys don't just close your ears on this part because it doesn't apply to you.
Yeah. All right. So I'm basically going to just say this is not like the scorched earth revelation that happened when the College Board back in, gosh, I don't even know how many years ago, the new version of the SAT had debuted in
2016.
spring of 2016.
Big news in the college world. I still remember it.
Yeah, and it was going back from being at a 2,400 point scale to the 1,600 point scale of your. All of the content was going to change, and there was going to be all this alignment with Common Core and blah blah blah. Everyone was freaking out about it. The reason why the media hasn't erupted in the same way about this news of a digital version of the SAT debuting for current freshmen.
It should have happened a long time ago.
Yes, it's about bringing these exams into the 21st century,
right,
and making the experience more streamlined for proctors, because it is awful work. You get paid next to nothing, and it's very difficult, I think, to again wrangle all of these students in a busy room or gymnasium or wherever it is that they're able to run these events. But students are going to see, instead of the 3-hour multiple choice assessments that they're used to doing on paper, it's converted to a 2-hour digital test that is going to be either taken on laptops or tablets. And basically, it's kind of like actually the GRE that I mentioned earlier that I had taken for graduate school. This exam is split into 2 modules, and based on how you perform on the first, let's say, verbal section, then recalibrates the difficulty of questions that appear in the second section. And then the same thing happens for the math on this digital version of the SAT. So you're getting more questions delivered to you that are within your wheelhouse, and it makes the experience of taking the test feel a little bit more seamless. Okay. So yeah.
Do you think, well, and I don't know if I saw this or not, but right now the tests are typically, they try to do them in the high schools on Saturdays. A lot of the local high schools are starting to do school day test sites, blah, blah. Is it still gonna be like that? Or are they gonna go more to, like, when you took the GRE, you went to or the LSAT, or, but you would go to a testing site. Is that what they're thinking, or you don't know yet?
So they're saying that they're going to rely more heavily on schools, just as they have currently for in-person testing sites, to be the locations, and that it's going to be a mix of either using existing computer labs and technology at the schools, and or students bringing in their own devices. And that's where it gets a little bit dodgy because we don't know, can we rely on students bringing in their own computers? Is there the propensity
Is that
for
unfair for
cheating?
students who don't have computers?
Yeah, exactly. So College Board hasn't really worked out those fine details yet. But they have said actually that this is going to be a completely new way of offering the test, and they're going to ditch any paper-based assessment. So there will not be paper and digital exams offered simultaneously.
Right, and paper-based, there's just so much cheating that goes on. That's why it's been so surprising. That's why I was excited when the ACT was supposed to change and they didn't. Okay, so the last, and then we'll see what questions we haven't answered. Okay, so Matty, in just a couple sentences for each, we'll start with the class. So advice, like what, and if I have advice, I'll throw it in too. But so for the class of 23, that's this year's juniors. What's your advice regarding standardized testing?
Yeah, so if I had a minute to talk to you, I would say, one, you're probably going to plan to take an exam when it's convenient, when it's safe to do so. And most students plan to sit for, as I said earlier, about 2 official tests before the culmination of their college applications when they're applying in fall.
You typically have to late fall of senior year to get your test in.
Exactly. And you're going to be assembling lists as a family around your dining room table around what colleges are best for you, with your college counselors potentially. And note that although there is this en masse adoption of test optional policies, that there is, quote, this spectrum of optionality. You want to read between the lines a little bit and know that just because you might want to share a score with one particular institution does not mean that you have to, that it's compulsory to share with others. You're going to be using testing only to buffer, to make your application look better and improve, and when it's additive, right? You'll include test scores. Yeah. In other cases, don't worry, and always be mindful of those institutions that are either requiring the exams, so it's all or nothing. If you don't have a score, you won't be eligible, or those that are test-free, like essentially the UW that we mentioned earlier, and the UCs and other California state schools where you cannot submit a test score whatsoever. Those are going to be the anomalies, but they're not going to impact you as far as needing to have a score. You cannot turn in a score whatsoever, right? So that would be my general advice.
Okay. So then class of 24, and again, and this is where, again, we just don't have a crystal ball and things can change. Probably pretty much the same advice, just again, because sophomore shouldn't be doing anything. The only thing you should have done is take the PSAT in the fall if you did that, and right, and just kind of just keep attending Find Your Fit sessions, because maybe we'll be here next year again talking about what's changed from this year. So, but anyway, anything else you would add for the class of 24 or the class of 25?
No, just keep your eyes peeled. Look at the shifting landscape of policies. We'll keep you apprised at Compass if you want to check out our guide, our website, or our newsletter. As soon as those changes are announced, for example, a college flips from optional to required or from required to test-free, we're always, our fingers are on the pulse of that, all right? But basically, when you're applying to college, it's not going to be a massive list that you'll be applying to, ideally, as long as you follow the guidance of sage folks like Mary Pat. And you'll be able to individually research the stated testing policies at those schools and determine whether or not you're planning to submit your results.
Okay. So let me answer some questions here. So somebody was asking about UW. So UW is, okay, first of all, UW's website is phenomenal. Okay. They are so clear. So just go to their website, type in standardized testing. But this is what, and UW has good relationships with the college counselors here in town, and they're always talking with us. What they told us is, so for admission, so UW will never, ever, ever use a student's test scores to penalize a student. And when UW is looking at students for admission, so you can submit your test scores. And I'll tell you, if you have really good test scores, it doesn't hurt you, because they can use it for placement in classes and stuff like that, but they black them out. They can't see them. And so this is what UW told us. So last year they had about, 45,000 students apply. Something like 23,000 students were admitted. And there were about 100 students who were right on the cusp, but they didn't quite make it. And they said, we will look to see if these 100 students have test scores. And if they're exceptional, not 50th percentile, these are the big guns. If they have them, that could be enough to put them into the admit pile. And out of those 100 students that they looked at, it was 10. 10 students got admitted because of their test scores. So they can't say they're test blind because they did use them. But that's the deal with UW. So, but they're very clear on their website. So let me see what else we got here. Let's see. So someone said, it's a good idea to take both the SAT and ACT. And again, you can't, I mean, there's no right or wrong here. Every time students take this though, it's a lot of time and all this. That's why personally, I think it's better to find out which one either you test better on, and there's something called concordance charts. You can type it, Google search concordance chart, and it'd say, oh, if you got a 1250 on the PSAT and you got a 27 on the ACT, whichever one is higher, like by a bit, that's the one you should probably focus on. A lot of times though, as Matty said, students test pretty much the same because the tests aren't that dramatically different. And I always just say to the student, did you like, and no one likes either, but did you like one better than the other? And sometimes it's gonna be like, oh my gosh, yes, I like the ACT is more, straightforward, or kids like, oh no, I love math, and the SAT is more math oriented. So you can't, I mean, there's nothing wrong with, it's not like, something bad happens, but I'm just trying to use students, I'm trying to eliminate as much stress and anxiety from the testing process as I can. And that's why I don't like students to take both real tests, but you certainly can.
Yeah, there's much ado about parsing out these minute differences between the exams. And if your student, it's hard to corral them to take practice tests, go with the exam that's more convenient for them to sign up for.
Yes, because you do have to be strategic with, and there's schedules, the months that they're offered. And like I tell it, like, I always like to share my own personal failures that I've done. So when my son, who's way out of high school now, he was a junior, and a couple things I did wrong. So he had some buddies, their mom called me up. It was like August of right before junior year started. And she said, hey, I've signed my boys up for this SAT class or ACT class. Does Jack want to do it? I'm like, of course Jack wants to do it. I don't even ask him, I just sign him. I say to Jack, I signed you up for this ACT class. And he gets this look on his face, but he's a good boy. And okay. So he goes to the class for 8 weeks. It was like a $600 class or something like that. Anyways, the class is done. The next week he takes the real ACT, and he got the exact same score on the real ACT as he did on the practice test that they gave him the first week.
No.
No, again, this is all on me. And I said to him, I was like, oh, man, what happened, Jack? Like, what a waste of money that was. And a couple things. So I did not ask him. And I just signed him up. So he was starting junior year. He had his first AP classes. He was taking AP Chem and AP Calc. And I will tell you, those classes were kicking his butt. So he had lots of homework, and it was not a good time. The other thing is my son played football. He's like, so, when do you play football? You play August through November. So he's doing practice every day. But the biggest thing was, if I had asked him and I didn't do that then, what I always tell parents is say, ask your student what they're willing to do and accept the answer. Because if you want something that's going to have conflict between us, because again, we're not doing it, it's the kids are doing it. And a kid can say, yeah, I'm sorry. But anyways, if I had asked my son, what do you think about taking a class? He would have looked at me and said, I hate tutors. I like to do things on my own. And it's true. He's a smart kid, but he doesn't like tutors, and he likes to teach himself. So he didn't do all that great. And then, and again, so I said, like, look at the calendar. If you've got 5 AP classes or 5 AP tests in May, don't be taking standardized testing around, like, it doesn't make sense. Or if you're in competitive skiing, don't do it in the winter, just because, but anyways, so for my son, what worked for us, I got a book from Amazon with practice tests. And again, nobody wants to, I mean, it's really hard to be self-motivated and be like, oh, I'm going to spend all this time. But I would say to them in the summer, I'm like, oh, before you go out today, you got to take the math test. And you go, oh, okay. And you sit down, you take the math test, and I'd correct it. And I'd say, oh, okay, these are the ones you got wrong. Tomorrow you have to study. And those books are great because they don't say the answer is B. They walk you through how do you get to the answer. And I always tell kids, if you don't know what you did wrong, you're just going to keep getting it wrong. So again, whether it's a tutor or, again, everybody's different. My daughter, she could not self-study at all, but a tutor helped her do that incremental increase in the ACT that made a huge difference. And so there's all sorts, everybody's different. There's no right or wrong. So yeah, thank you, Matty. Go do your commercial.
I'll just say at the very end, just so folks, if you're curious about reaching out and want to learn more about what Compass does, I've included in the chat a link to, you can get a free consultation with a director like me at Compass that can chat with you until you're both blue in the face, everything you want to know about testing policies, advising, building a testing timeline. That comes at no cost or obligation to work with us. I find that starting with both a director consultation and perhaps a practice test with Compass, which we can also do for free, is a really great platform, regardless of whether or not you do adaptive online work with Khan Academy, get a book, a classroom program, or a private tutor. If you want to stay in touch with me, my email is matty@compassprep.com. That's our general office line. We're a small and mighty team. And our general website is compassprep.com. So Mary Pat, I just want to say massive thank you for allowing me to chat with families today. It was really a delight, and I hope you all enjoyed it.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. So I'm going to
just I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, okay. And then I just got my last little slide that I have. Okay, if I can get this to work. Come on. All right. Stupid. There we go. Oops. What do I do now? Screen sharing. I really should have someone help me with this stuff. I don't know why I have such a hard time. Anyway, somebody was asking, this is something we didn't talk about. They said that their child has, here we go, that their child has a short window to prepare for a test. And what can they do? And we didn't talk about this, but, and Matty, correct me if I'm wrong, what I've always heard is to prepare for these tests on the short end is about 8 weeks. The more recommended tends to be 12 weeks. But I always, again, keeping in mind that this is supposed to be material that a typical junior in high school knows, which is why, again, sophomores shouldn't be doing it. Freshmen shouldn't be doing it. They don't know this material yet. But if you are a junior or you're going into your senior year, it's not like 10 hours of work. It's usually, like maybe an hour with a tutor and then maybe an hour or so of homework. That's how I view it, but I could be, what would you say to that? Oh, yes. And by the way, this is the next, I'm going to be doing it's just going to be me alone, having technical difficulties all by myself. But I'm doing a College 101 workshop. This is for high school students and parents. And this is going to be a very deep and technical, all about applying to college and what colleges look at and how do you create a college list and standardized testing. And it's going to be on March 15th. So you can sign up for that. Anyways, Matty.
Awesome. Yeah. So honestly, brass tacks, like if you are going to do anything whatsoever, at least taking a single practice test and getting some basic exposure to the material is essential, right? Yeah. That should be the most important. If your student isn't going to do anything, that is your bare minimum. Yeah. And that basically, based on your budget and the amount of time that you have, you're going to be able to map on either additional kind of self-prep sessions by yourself using Khan Academy for the SAT, maybe working with a tutor, maybe doing a class. And those tend to take, if they're doing it right, I'm not a fan of boot camps, all right? They tend to be about 6 to 8 weeks of continuous regimented effort because these exams are more like marathons than they are sprints. Right? You really are going to need to employ a lot of the tips and strategies and content that you're learning on a regular basis. So that way, when you show up for your next official SAT or ACT, you can go on autopilot. You feel very relaxed.
It helps with the test anxiety because you're familiar. Somebody, I'm just getting this question there. Somebody says, I just want you to clarify, and Maddie, you can say it with me, do not sign up for the optional essay section for the SAT or ACT, unless the only exception to that if you plan to apply to a military academy.
That's right. Yeah, the Military Service Academy, specifically the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. That's really the only one.
And I've never had a student apply there. So unless that's your path, you do not sign up. And if you are signed up for one and you're like, oh my gosh, my mom signed me up, you can tell them when you go in, I'm not taking it, and it's okay. Nothing bad happens.
Great. Awesome.
Let me see if there's anything else here before we hang up here. Okay, chat. Okay, got that. Thank you. Will you post the resources shown in the PowerPoint? Which I think is all the Compass. That was all the Compass stuff. So,
yeah, I'll include that in the follow-up. I'll send an email to Mary Pat with resources and links to those things that will be included with the recording.
So the Lake Washington Schools Foundation, they send everything out. They do a great job. And thank you for everybody who made a donation to the Lake Washington Schools Foundation. They do just such wonderful work, and I'm thrilled to be part of them. And Maddie, I know you are too, and really appreciate you sharing all your knowledge with us tonight, because I could not, you know so much, and I couldn't do this without you. So
my pleasure. My pleasure.
Well, everybody, you guys have a good night, and glad we don't have the rain we did yesterday. And if any time, just to remind families, I am a resource in the community. If you have an email or if you have a question about something about the college process, you can send it to the Lake Washington Schools Foundation, but you can also send it to findyourfit@lwsf.org, and I get back to families very quickly. So, all right. Well, Maddie, you have a good night.
Thank you. You too, Mary Pat. Good night, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.